Chapter 15 of Brenda, Her School, and Her Club. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel Bozier. Brenda, Her School, and Her Club by Helen Leah Reed. Chapter 15. A Poet at Home. One day Julia had an adventure. Not a wildly exciting one as some of the girls liked to describe what had happened to them, but one that she always remembered with pleasure. It was a windy day in early January, and there was a fine glaze on the ground from a storm of the day before. As she was slipping along down Beacon Street on her way home from school, it was all she could do to hold her footing. One hand was kept in constant use holding down the brim of her hat, which seemed inclined to blow away. Luckily she had no books to carry, and so when she suddenly saw some sheets of letter paper whirling past her, she was able to rush on it and pick them up as they were dashed against a lamp-post. Another moment, and they would have been driven by another gust of wind down a short street leading to the river. When she had the papers safely in her possession, Julia naturally looked around to see to whom they belonged. The owner was not far away, for just a few steps behind her was an old gentleman, not very tall, dressed all in black with a high silk hat. Under his arm he carried a book, and as he held out his hand towards her, Julia had no doubt that he was the owner of the wandering manuscript.
"Thank you, my child,"
he said as he held the sheets towards him.
"Another gust, and I should have had to compose a new poem to take the place of the one that was so ready to go to press against the lamp-post."
"There, that was not a very brilliant pun, was it?" he asked Julia, for Julia was now walking along by his side. "Why, sir," she had begun to say, looking up in his face. Then suddenly she gave a start. Surely she had seen that face before, but where? Yet almost in a shorter time than I have taken to tell it, she recognized the owner of the papers. He was certainly no other than Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the famous autocrat of the breakfast table, several of whose poems she knew almost by heart. All her old shyness came back to her. She did not exactly dare to say that she recognized him, and all she could think of was another question in relationship to the manuscript. Were they some of your own poems?" she managed to stammer. "It would have been dreadful if they had been lost."
"Not half as dreadful," he replied, smiling, "as if they had been written by someone else. As a matter of fact, these were sent to me by an unfledged poet who wished me to tell him whether he would stand a chance of getting them into the publisher's hands. He told me to take great care of them, as he had no copy. I read his note at my publisher's just now, and I felt bound to carry the manuscript home. But I'm not sure that it would not have been a good thing to let loose a sheet or two to teach him a lesson. He should not send a thing to a stranger without making a copy."
The poet, of course, did not speak to Julia in precisely these words, but this was the drift of what he had said, and it was in about this form that she repeated it to her aunt and Brenda at the luncheon table.
"What else did he say?"
her aunt had asked with great interest. "Oh, he thanked me again for picking up the papers, complimented me for being so sure-footed on such a slippery sidewalk, and what do you think, Aunt Anna? When he heard that I had not long been in Boston, he asked me to call some afternoon to see him. He is always at home after 4. I walked along until he reached his doorstep. Do you know he lives very near here? I was so surprised to find out. Have you ever been there, Brenda?" "No," said Brenda, shaking her head. "I did not exactly notice whom you were talking about." "Why, Dr. Holmes," replied Julia. "Oh," said Brenda, with a stare that seemed to imply that this name did not mean much to her.
"Why, you know, Brenda,
Oliver Wendell Holmes," prompted her mother, and still Brenda looked rather blank. "Brenda," said Mrs. Barlow, "I'm surprised. Surely you remember how pleased you were with the last leaf when I had you learn it last summer? You must remember that I told you that the poet who wrote it lives in Boston?" "I dare say," answered Brenda carelessly, "but I had forgotten. I don't see why Julia should be so excited about meeting a poet. There must be ever so many of them everywhere."
"Oh, Brenda,"
responded her mother. "I do wish that you would take more interest in the affairs of your own city. Here is Julia, who has been in Boston but a short time, and I am sure she knows more about our famous men and women than you who have lived here all your life." For a wonder, Brenda did not laugh at what her mother said, nor take offense. "I never shall be a bookworm," she said very good-naturedly. "I am willing to leave that all to Julia." So when Julia asked her one afternoon if she would not like to go with her to call on Dr. Holmes, she declined with thanks, and left Julia free to invite Edith. As the two friends walked up the short flights of stone steps to the front door, their hearts sank a little. To make a call on a poet is rather a formidable thing. They pressed each other's hands as they heard the maid opening the door to admit them.
"Just wait here a moment,"
said the maid, after they had inquired for the master of the house, and she showed them into a small room at the left of the entrance. It seemed to be merely a reception room, but it was very pretty, with white woodwork and large flowered yellow paper. There was a carved table in the center, with writing materials and inkstand, and a little other furniture besides a few handsome chairs. Tall bookcases matching the woodwork occupied the recesses, and they were filled with books in substantial bindings. In a moment the maid had returned and asked them to follow her. At the head of the broad stairs they saw the poet himself standing to meet them with outstretched hand. When Julia mentioned Edith's name,
"Ah," he said, "that is a good old Boston name, and if I mistake not, I used to know your grandfather."
And then when Edith had satisfied him on this point, he turned to Julia, and in a bantering way spoke of the service she had done him that windy day. When he made them sit down beside him, one on each side, while he occupied a large leather armchair drawn up before his fire, and asked them one or two questions about their studies and their taste in literature. As he talked, Julia's eyes wandered to the bronze figure of Father Time on the mantelpiece, and then to the little revolving bookcase, on which she could help not notice a number of volumes of Dr. Holmes' own works. The old gentleman followed her glance and said,
"They make a pretty fair showing for one man, but my publishers are getting ready to bring out a complete edition of my works, and that makes me realize my age."
After a moment, as if reflecting, he asked quickly,
"Does either of you write poetry?"
"Oh, no, sir," answered Edith quickly. "We couldn't."
"Why, it isn't so very hard," he said. "At least I should judge not by the number of copy of verses that are sent to me to examine. Poetry deals with common human emotions, and almost any one with a fair vocabulary thinks that he can express himself in verse. But nearly everything worth saying has been said. Words and expressions seem very felicitous, but he cannot expect other persons to see his work as he sees it."
"It depends, I suppose," said Edith shyly, "on whose work it is."
"I am afraid," replied the poet, "that there is no absolute standard for verse-makers. It has always seemed to me that the writer of verse is almost in the position of a man who makes a mould for a plaster cast, or something of that kind. Whatever liquid mixture he puts into the mould will surely fit it. So the verse is the mould into which the poet puts his thoughts, and from his point of view it is sure to fit."
Though Edith may not have grasped the full force of the poet's meaning, Julia was sure that she understood him. "Do you really have a good deal of poetry sent to you to read?" she asked.
"Every mail," he answered, "brings me letters from strangers from every corner of the globe. Some contain poems in my honor as specimens of what the poets could do. Others are accompanied by long manuscripts on which my opinion is asked. I am chary now about expressing my opinion, for publishers have a way of quoting very unfairly in their advertisement. If I write, your book would be very charming if it were not so carelessly written. The publisher quotes merely, 'very charming,' and prints this in large type."
Both girls smiled at the expression of droll sorrow that came over the poet's face as he spoke.
"And I am so very unfortunate myself," he added. "When I try to get an autograph of any consequence, Now, I sent Gladstone a copy of work on trees in which I thought he would be interested. He returned the compliment with a copy of one of his books, but—"
here he paused.
"He wrote his thanks on a postcard."
Again the girls laughed.
"Dear me," he concluded, "this cannot interest young creatures like you. Do you care for poetry?"
"Yes, indeed we do," cried Julia. "We just love your poetry."
"Well, well," said the poet with a twinkle in his eyes, "perhaps you would like to hear me read something?"
The beaming faces that met his glance were sufficient answer, and taking a volume from the table he began in a voice that was a trifle husky, though full of expression.
"This is a ship of pearl which poets feign, sails the unshadowed main, the venturous bark that flings on the sweet summer wind its venturous wings, in gulfs enchanted where the siren sings, and coral reefs lie bare, where the cold sea maids raise to sun their streaming hair."
When he had finished the stanza, he looked up inquiringly. "The chambered nautilus," murmured Julia.
"Oh, you know it then," said the poet.
"Oh, yes, and I love it," she answered. Then with a smile of appreciation, adjusting his glasses, Dr. Holmes read to the end of the poem in his wonderfully musical voice. When it was finished, the girls would have liked to have asked more, but the poet rose to replace the volume.
"Come," he said, "you have listened to the poem which all I have written I liked the best. Now I wish to show you my favorite view."
Following him to the deep bay window, they looked out across the river. It was much the same view to which Julia was accustomed in her uncle's house, and yet it was looking at the river with new eyes to have the poet pointing out all the towns, 7 or 8 in number, which he could see from that window. Somerville, Medford, Belmont, Arlington, Charleston, Brooklyn, and 1 or 2 others, perhaps, besides Cambridge with its spires and chimneys.
"In winter," said Dr. Holmes, "there is not much to see besides the tugboats and the gulls, but in the early spring it is a delight to me to watch the crews rowing by, and an occasional pleasure boat. And I remember—"
But what it was he did not say, for as Edith turned her eyes towards an oil painting on the wall near by, he said,
"Oh, of course you know who that is. Of course you recognize the famous Dorothy Q. Now look at the portrait closely, and tell me what you think of that cheek. Could you imagine anyone so cruel as to have struck a sword into it? Yet there, if your eyes are sharp enough, you will see where a British soldier of the Revolution thrust his rapier."
When both girls admitted that they could not see the scar,
"That only shows," he said, "how clever the man was who made the repairs."
Before they turned from the window, he made them notice the tall factory chimneys on the other side of the river, which he called his thermometers, because according to the direction in which the smoke curled upwards, he was able to tell how the wind blew and decided in what direction he should walk.
"Remember," he said, "when you reach my age, always walk with your back to the wind."
And at this the girls smiled, they feeling it would be many years before they should need to follow this advice, yet during their call how many things they had to see and to remember. He let each of them hold for a moment the gold pen with which he had written Elsie Werner and the autocrat papers, and Julia turned over the leaves of the large Bible and the concordance on the top of his writing desk. Dr. Holmes called their attention to the beautiful landscape hanging on one wall, done in fine needlework by the hands of his accomplished daughter-in-law, and he told them a story or two connected with another picture in the room. Julia, as she looked about, thought she had seldom seen a prettier room than this, with its cheerful rugs, massive furnitures, and fine pictures, all so simple and yet so dignified. When the poet pointed out the great pile of letters lying on his desk, he told them that this was about the number that he received every day. "But you don't answer them all!" exclaimed Edith almost breathlessly.
"No, indeed," he laughed. "My secretary goes through them every morning and decide which ought to be given to me to read, and then, well, if it's anything very personal, I try to answer it myself. Often, however, I let her write the answer while I simply add the signature.
Edith gave Julia a little nudge, and they were both at the age when the possession of an autograph of a famous man is something to be ardently desired. But neither of them had quite dared to ask Dr. Holmes for his. It is possible that he saw the little nudge, or perhaps he read the eager expression on their faces, for almost before they realized it, he had placed in the hand of each of them a small volume in a white cover, and bidding them open their books, he said,
"Well, I must put something on that bare fly leaf."
So seating himself at his table with a quill pen in his hand, he wrote slowly and evidently with some effort the name of each of them, followed by the words,
"With the regards of Oliver Wendell Holmes,"
and then the year and the day of the month. As he handed them the book, he opened the door, and with a word or two more of half-bantering thanks to Julia for her assistance on the windy day, he bowed them down the stairs. So impressed were they by the visit that they had little to say until they reached home, where they found Mrs. Barlow a very sympathetic listener. Brenda, who happened to be at home, looked with interest at the little volumes of selection of Dr. Holmes' writing with their valuable autographs, and said, "Well, you might have taken me too."
"Why, Brenda,
I am sure I asked you," said Julia, "but you declared you would not speak to a poet for anything in the world." They all laughed at this, a proceeding which this time did not annoy Brenda. Mrs. Barlow admired the little books.
"But I hope that you did not stay too long," she said gently, "for I have been told that Dr. Holmes has a way of sending off guests who tires him by bringing out one of these little gift books."
"Oh, I don't think we tired him," said Julia. "At any rate, he was too polite to show it, but I'm glad we have the books." End of chapter 13. Read by Rachel Bozier.